You're listening to the Mechanic.com.au podcast, Australia's #1 podcast for automotive service and repair professionals. This week's podcast is proudly brought to you by Trico Wiper Blades, seeing you through. I'm your host, Jason O, and today we're joined by Will Vagg, who is the National Sales Manager at Trico. Welcome to the show, Will. How's your week going, mate?
G'day, Jason. Very good. Happy to be here.
It always is, mate. Where are you calling us from today?
As I think a lot of people are, I'm working from home at the moment in sunny Frankston, Victoria. But we're getting through this. We're getting through these strange times, slowly but surely.
It is a challenging time, and today we're going to be talking about the past, present, and future of wipers. And we are actually in colder times in Australia at the moment, and Melbourne seems to have more rain than everybody at the moment. You guys are doing all right down there.
Oh, it's absolutely beautiful wipers weather. We're very happy when it rains here at Trico.
Well, let's jump straight into it. No time like the present. Why was there an initial need for wipers?
Around the turn of the century, vehicles started becoming more and more popular, and not just something that people would use as a weekend trip or a weekend novelty.
Okay.
So as they commercialized, people started using them in all weather conditions.
Yeah, right.
When you start using them in sleet and rain instead of just in the nice days, you obviously need to see.
Yeah.
So at the time, people were physically getting out of their cars and hand wiping down windscreens, particularly in snow conditions.
It just sounds like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? It sounds like, that's hard to comprehend. Well, how did Trico first start in wipers?
Well, the wiper was initially invented in 1908 by Mary Anderson. She patented the first windscreen clearer, although it never ended up getting used commercially. Okay. It wasn't until 1916 that Mr. O'Shea actually hit a cyclist in Buffalo, New York,
right,
on a rainy night in his National Roadster.
Wow!
Now the cyclist was unhurt, but John was obviously a lot shaken by it, so he wanted a solution to the poor visibility on his windscreen, and he invented something called the rain rubber.
Rain rubber.
Which is the wiper as we know it. The difference between Mary Anderson's original invention and his is that he's used a spring to keep constant tension on the windscreen, and using rubber on a metal frame, which is almost exactly the wiper that we know today, but it was invented 100 years ago.
That's just amazing. That's amazing. And once again, necessity has seen evolution produce a product that makes our lives better. Well, how did Trico, we know they got involved. Did they have any involvement in the initial creation of the wipers?
Yeah, absolutely. So Trico is really the first commercial success from a wiper's point of view. So like I said, there was a window cleaning device that was originally invented, but it had to be used from the outside. It was a block of wood, whereas this device was specifically designed to be fitted to a vehicle, actually in the aftermarket.
Right.
Funnily enough, John O'Shea actually fitted a Trico wiper system to Henry Ford's own Model T.
Wow.
As it was an aftermarket accessory back then.
Well,
I know, it's crazy.
Nothing like, a celebrity brand endorsement to get you across the line, I suppose, isn't it?
But it was very quick. So it was around 1916 that it was patented, and then by the 20s, the start of the 20s, it was ubiquitous. It was across all vehicles.
Wow!
Obviously, you needed to see.
Well, I'm thinking the name Trico obviously has some sort of background behind it. Is it an acronym for something?
It is. It's actually short for Tricontinental,
oh, okay.
Which, as far as I'm concerned, from John O'Shea, it shows you his personality a little bit, because this company called Tricontinental was established in New York by itself in 1917. And it wasn't until the 20s where they opened up Trico or Tricontinental in the UK. And then it actually became its namesake, Tricontinental, in 1957 when it was launched in little old Australia.
Wow. Well, it's certainly a heck of a journey for Trico. And again, born out of necessity. And it's one of those inventions that has just gone on, strength to strength. What were the first versions of them like? You did mention that it was sort of metal and rubber. Talk us a little bit through those.
Yeah, it was very similar to what we know now. The very, very, very first version was designed to fit in the slot of the two-piece windscreens. I don't know if you've ever seen those on little English sports cars where they can fold down one half of the windscreen.
Yep.
So the original version sat in that slot, which means you could grab it from inside the car and slide a spring tension piece of rubber back and forth across the windscreen to clear water.
Out.
Yeah, it's crazy, but it is very similar to what we have now. Wipers, as we know them, were introduced about 10 years later,
Okay.
in the mid 20s, which is the idea that it was bolted to the bottom of the glass and then moved up and down in an arc. Shortly after that, Trico bought out the company that had patented the vacuum washer motor, so it didn't need to be done manually.
Wow. It's so interesting to hear the history of these sort of things. You take it for granted that you push a button and away it goes. And, occasionally you see somebody breaking down and they have that funny thing on YouTube where they got string either side out the windows and two guys are pulling them from side to side, which is always a good for a giggle. But
that's kind of close to the original version. But it's amazing that this one company's been doing this for 100 years. There's not many companies that do one thing for 100
and
years.
do it well. Well, what was the key point of difference compared to the competitors that you guys have got from the Trico products to what they were offering?
So the next companies to come along, or the big companies to come along in wipers, was Bosch and Valeo. So it's really Trico, Bosch and Valeo that are the key OE manufacturers worldwide,
Right.
even now. And that game, since Bosch hit the scene in the 20s, has really been a game of innovation. So like I said, Trico innovated the wiper motors, both vacuum and electric, then dual wiper systems, then multi-blade refills. Funnily enough, refills throughout the 40s and 50s were almost like a star design. There was many blades on the refill, which was an OE design.
Oh, so you could slide in a different corner, for want of a better reason.
Yeah, so instead of having one square edge that would roll from side to side, you had multiple edges as the blades moved back and forth. And this comes down to more the refinement of rubber as time goes on. Now that we have exceptional quality rubber with stabilizers in the material, we only need that one neat edge.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
And yeah, from there, each innovation came along and kept us ahead of the curve. But from my point of view, the big difference here locally is that Trico was established here in the 50s. We fit the first wiper system to the first Holdens. And we've done Holdens, Fords, and Toyotas in Australia, the whole time that they were being manufactured.
Right.
So having this local base of operations that created products that were specific to Australia, and we all know that Australia's weather conditions are very different.
Yeah.
Has allowed us to really stay ahead of the curve here in this country because we know the country.
Well, it's a good country to build a brand with, given those weather conditions and the harshness of our summers and even the cold of our winters and the rain that we get. But there's obviously along the way there's been some milestones that wipers have evolved through. Talk us through some of those.
Well, probably. I mean, they're over 100 years. There's heaps of different changes in design for refills and design for blades. Going from the shiny metal to the black metal, things like that. But probably the biggest change that we've seen in the last 100 years is that transition from a conventional metal wiper blade that takes a refill to a beam blade.
Right.
And these beam blades hit the scene roughly in the year 2000. Some, a little bit earlier than that, but started becoming mainstream then. And they were invented as a way to maintain better contact on curved windscreen.
Okay. Well,
So
I will hold you
yes.
there because I know that windscreens were laid back in the 2000s for wind, noise, and cabin quiet. So
100% correct. Yes. So as they started to develop these vehicles in wind tunnels, there was a requirement for more curvature, both north, south, and east, west on windscreens. And the European version of that is the beam blade, and the Japanese and Asian version of that requirement for a curved blade is the hybrid blade, the three-piece plastic blade that you'll see out in the market.
Okay. And
but probably, yes.
I was going to say, and one of the challenges obviously is the amount of connections. Is that right? You've got on these things?
Yes, it's huge. And being an OE manufacturer, this
It drives you nuts, doesn't it?
Oh, it's crazy. And the funny thing about the amount of different adapters that we've seen, really from about 2005 onwards, manufacturers started attempting to make their unique adapters. And really the only reason for this is to try and keep the OE blade being sold through the dealer network.
Right, okay.
There's actually there is no connection advantage or no performance advantage over the traditional hook mount compared to a push button or a side pin or a pinch tab. It's really just it's just a way to hold it onto the windscreen and keep that blade within the OE network.
Okay. And you guys offer a multi-fit system, is that right?
That's correct, yeah. So luckily our work in the OE means that we have a lot of the exact specifications and requirements for these connections. So very quickly as these new connections are developed, we can develop something that meets the requirements in the aftermarket. The multi-fit beam solution we have on our Trico Force and Trico Tech Blade is fantastic. It comes out of the packet with the hook adapter, which is the most common one you'll find, but then only one other adapter fits all the other arm types, or the most common arm types you'll find in the market,
Right.
as opposed to a million little pieces of plastic falling out of the pack.
Yeah, and that can be very frustrating. Well, let's have a look at where they are today, obviously. And let's talk about, say, the materials and technology. Going on where we were, say, 10, 15 years ago to where we are now, have the materials and technology evolved?
Well, like what we've talked about, we've moved away from metal scaffolding holding the rubber refill in place into beam. But funnily enough, almost 100 years ago, we got it right the first time. The best thing to clear glass is natural rubber.
Right.
And critically, the reason why natural rubber works so well is because it's resistant in many different weather and temperature conditions. But more importantly, it doesn't leave a residue on glass.
Okay.
So 50 or so years ago, maybe 30 to 40 years ago, silicon was pioneered as a reason to as a way to clear windscreen glass, and it was fantastic. You could use it in high temperature, low temperature. It lasted forever, but unfortunately, it left a residue on the glass, and that changed the friction of the wipers, and of course, changed the way it wiped the screen. And you just can't have varying wipe quality over time. No. That's where rubber really stands out.
That's interesting because, you see a wide variety of different styles of wipers being offered, but, it's a bit like tyres and it's a bit like rubber quality and so forth. You've got to choose the right one for the right car. And we've got a diverse car park at the moment, requiring new and different parts coming on board. How have you guys responded to that? I mean, there's that many different lengths and sizes you've got to come up against.
Yeah, it's been very tricky, actually. One of the challenges has been this exact fit range. So as we see more and more manufacturers releasing different arm types, one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, do we want to add these adapters to the multi-fit packs and increase their price? Or do we want to release an exact fit version? By exact fit, what I mean is a wiper blade with exactly that connector on there.
Yes.
So what we've done in the last few years, I'll give you a very good example. Mazda released a new type of push-button adapter. We call it an FZ, or a fitted zone adapter, from 2018 onwards on their CX range. And as we know, it takes about 2 to 3 years for vehicles to really leave the dealer service network and get into the aftermarket, and demand starts increasing for the aftermarket version of that adapter. As you know, you only change wipers about once a year, so that's 1 to 2 changes.
Right.
So what we've done with that particular one is released an exact fit version in our Australian exact fit range, so that when you need it, it is there and available for you, but it doesn't push up the price of our multi-fit range because you're only going to encounter these once every couple of months or even once a year.
Yeah. Well, that's a good way of responding to it. Building them is one thing, offering them is another, but how do you do the R&D on that many? I mean, do you test them all, or do you test the compound? How do you go about doing it?
Again, that falls back into our OE relationships. So it's crazy the amount of demands that OEMs make for each individual wiper specifications.
Right.
They have to meet a certain rate of curvature. They have to meet a certain rate of friction. They have to meet a certain amount of wind lift. So on each vehicle and each vehicle type, there's a huge amount of variability, and that then kind of leads into the testing that we do. So on one side, you've got the engineering side of actually getting the wiper to connect, but that doesn't even hold a candle to the amount of testing that you need to do of how the wiper performs on the windscreen. From tests like tension, durability, corrosion testing, environmental testing, acoustic, wind lift, friction. it just continues on and on. One of my favorite ones actually is this horrifying machine that picks up the wiper blade and slams it up and down on the windscreen repeatedly.
There you go.
To simulate in winter or snow environments, people will come out to their cars and repeatedly flick their wiper blades up and down to clear snow.
Yeah.
So watching that thing in action is terrifying, to be honest.
I do know that the vision of a car from the inside is quite often not the make or break for the operator. And we've all been in vehicles where the vision has been poor, and in inclement conditions, never more so. So realistically, we probably take the wiper blades a little bit for granted when it comes to their job. So no doubt that R&D just solidifies the need to have a clear vision. Let's hop in.
I'll touch on that actually, if that's okay, because the Australian law, ADI for wipers is ADR, sorry, for wipers is very interesting on that note. There are very specific specifications you must meet when you're creating a wiper system for a vehicle that's manufactured in this country, even though we don't have manufacturing anymore. But very, very specific tolerances. Whereas from an ADR or an aftermarket point of view, apart from the roadworthy requirements that you must clear the windscreen, they're incredibly vague, which can give you pause for thought when you're bringing in wipers from another country that were never designed or had never been worked with OE manufacturers, because they've not had any requirements whatsoever from that safety point of view.
Right. That's interesting. It does open up a can of worms, but I know you can be anywhere at any point in time, dry weather, wet weather, and if the screen's not clear, it's a very frustrating experience behind the wheel of a car. Well, let's hop in the time machine, head forward 20 years, okay? We're a lot older, mate. I'm sure we're still going to look pretty good, but we're a lot older. What do you think? What do you think wipers will look like in the year 2040?
I think in 20 years from now, we'll still have systems that are very similar to what we have now, in the sense that we will, while we need to look out of glass and while we need to look at our environment around us, we'll have a requirement to keep that clean. Now, whether or not we see some changes in adapters or arm types, that's a different question.
Do you think they'll still exist? Do you think we will still have that physical wiper?
I think while we have, like I said, while we need to look out of a windscreen, it will. There will come a time at some point in the future, maybe not 20 years from now, where, of course, autonomous vehicles would become more popular, and there may be a vehicle that we have no need whatsoever to look out of, and we jump inside it and off it goes. But right. I think that's a long way off. I mean, we've got to get to the point where autonomous vehicles are the main used vehicle on the road before we really become accustomed to the idea of not even looking out of them.
Yeah, and will that, I guess you've got to ask the question, will we ever get to a point where there'll be no more refills of cars?
I think wipers will evolve down that route. So already we see beam blades are traditionally non-refillable, and we're moving away from that metal scaffolding design. And we've also talked about the adapters. So exact fit systems where each and every manufacturer has their own way of connecting will become more and more popular. I think Mercedes has been pioneering, say, jet on arm applications where the washer jets squirt actually out of the arm and blade itself, which means that you would have to go to Mercedes to replace that.
I reckon and of course, trucks have something similar. Like some of the trucks have that, don't they?
They do. Some Scania trucks and a few others have that already. And that's starting to move into passenger vehicles. But that's more of a design element or something that looks good but doesn't necessarily provide anything different or unique for the wiper system. It's still rubber on glass. Whereas some companies, like Tesla, are trying to get rid of wipers entirely by using lasers or sonic power.
You have to say that like Dr. Evil. Lasers.
Lasers. But we've actually seen that.
Will they become non-service? I mean, will we see non-service items like lifetime wipers?
I think if you go down the path of laser, sonic, air pressure removal, you could get to that stage. But we've seen this tried and failed. So about 10 years ago, Mercedes released one that used air pressure to blow water off the windscreen. But they didn't account for the fact that we've got bugs sailing through the air at the same time. So the bugs just go straight through the jet of air. And then you've got no way of removing that from your windscreen while you're driving. You would have to pull over. So those technologies, laser, sonic, and air, they're a long way off being really workable yet. Although that doesn't stop Apple. So if we release an iCar, I'm sure it'll have some very, very frustrating wiper system that will half work, but be very cool.
Absolutely. You probably have a selection you'll be able to choose from.
Absolutely, and you pay for each different type.
What about the DIY service side of things? Do you think we'll ever see that like wrap up and finalise, or do you think that'll continue on as well?
I think it will, and for the foreseeable future. So while we see some oil companies preparing for the rise of electric vehicles, etc., the idea of changing your wipers should be around for quite a long time, because we have a requirement to physically touch the glass to not only clear water but to keep it clean. And when you're doing that, your part wears out.
I think the other side of it is you're going to drive your car in sunshine and rain, and that's the reality of it. That's the two conditions that we've got. So you're going to need it at some point, aren't you?
Absolutely, and when you're using friction and when you're clearing your screen, those things wear out, just like changing your cloths around your house and changing your wipers. So I think we've got a good future for wipers.
Well, as we head towards the back door, I've got one more final question for you. So you're going to have to put your nose to the grindstone on this one, Will. I'm chasing down that one fact that a lot of people and workshop owners, mechanics don't know about Trico. Just blow our socks off, mate. What have you got for us?
Oh, without telling some funny stories from the last few years in Australia that people don't know from Christmas parties, probably the big one is that refills are now almost wholly unique to Australia.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So all of the other Trico's in all 5 continents now, and all of those continents do more blades than refills. As the mechanic just changes over the full blade assembly, and we still in Australia do more refills than blades. Funnily enough, the famous refill, the TTR 610 and TTR 710 Trico's twin rail refills, are 100% unique to Australia. They are sold nowhere else in the world because they were originally designed for use on Australian Fords, Holdens, and Toyotas. In fact, if you go and buy those original service parts, you'll pull a TTR out of the box. So
they join the kangaroo and the koala as being uniquely Australian.
100% uniquely Australian. Wow. Those specific refills are, of course, there are refills around the world, but that design with the end latch, the way we know it, is an Australian design.
You're getting very patriotic there, mate. I like it. Well, look, thanks very much for coming on the show, Will. If any of our listeners have any follow-up questions about anything we've discussed today, they can go ahead and reach out to Trico via Mechanic.com.au community. If you're not already a member of Mechanic.com.au, join the thousands of other mechanics around Australia who are earning, learning and networking more at Mechanic.com.au, the home of Australia's mechanics, by creating a free account today. Thanks for tuning into the Mechanic.com.au podcast, Australia's #1 podcast for automotive service and repair professionals. If you want to unlock a whole host of trade-only resources, including our private community, competitions, educational content, job opportunities, training, troubleshooting, and much, much more, go ahead and create a free account now at Mechanic.com.au. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Mechanic.com.au podcast soon.